Hello, welcome back. In an earlier video I discussed some of the issues I had come across while dealing in scrap metal for some buyers I have here in the United States. Since that time I've come across new insights about the nature of the international scrap trade both in and outside of the United States. This video is about sharing some of those insights with you. So let's take a look at some of the first things I came across. The first thing I want to talk about is the kind of trade deal you should work on if you're working just as a broker. Unless you have a solid working relationship, that is, unless the buyer or the seller knows you and have known you for a long time, you're going to have to stick to small deals because you're not going to have enough trust involved in the transaction to do large deals. Also, if you don't have a long-standing relationship with a buyer or seller, they're simply not going to want to do business with you. Also, doing a small deal allows you to make all the necessary mistakes, because you're going to make mistakes as you try and do the deals. As for doing transactions of, say, 30,000 metric tons way up to, say, 1,000,000 metric tons, the companies that have enough money to buy that much scrap, to rent that many containers, to rent a ship big enough to carry those kinds of loads on a repeat basis, are not going to need a small broker working from a small office. They will have an individual or an entire office dedicated to finding sellers and building working relationships. They will have people who go out to the scrap yards, who meet with the yard managers, and who sign long contracts for large amounts of HMS 1 and 2, or copper, or crushed engines, or whatever the case may be. Also, like any other major commodity, like petroleum or liquefied natural gas, scrap metal is often bought a year or two in advance from the major scrap yards in the United States and other parts of the world. The contracts are often written well in advance, so it's very hard to get large amounts of scrap metal, 20,000, 30,000 metric tons, for a client who does not have the necessary connections. Also, if you're dealing in other parts of the world, say for example the Caribbean, it's a little more difficult to do business in this part of the world if you're new to buying the scrap metal from yards in the islands in this part of the world. Some of the container companies, for example, have damage clauses in their contracts, and they want deposits for the containers. You can avoid this if you have a long-standing relationship with a seller of scrap metal or with a provider of container or shipping services. What I'd like to do now is give you a breakdown of just what's involved in doing a large containerized transaction, the cost involved, the logistics involved, so you'll see just how and why this would be so difficult for someone who doesn't have the necessary contacts. Let's take a look. First, I'd like to make a few points about the scrap metal industry. With regard to the United States, 50% of all U.S. exports are recyclables, such as scrap metal from cars and engines, scrap equipment such as computers and machine parts, and scrap fabric and used clothing. In the case of the used clothing, large quantities of this clothing wind up in places such as West African countries, where its purchase is undermining indigenous African clothing manufacturing industries. Regarding the scrap metal from such countries as Nigeria, you should check with the country's exportation department to make sure there's no ban on the exportation of scrap metal from a given country, as in the case of Nigeria, for example. Secondly, there are many countries in Western Africa and in parts of Europe that are net importers of scrap metal. You should check with the embassy of the country that you want to do business with first and make sure there is no ban or any other tariffs or restrictions on the exportation of scrap metal. With regard to international trade scams, there's usually a modus operandi for the would-be scammer. What they will usually do is they will contact scrap buyers online in such online marketplaces as Zing or Facebook or places of this nature. They will offer them scrap at half the rate that it's going internationally. For example, if the market rate is, say, $200 a metric ton, these guys will offer it for $50, $60, $100. They claim to have the influence in the ministry and can arrange the usual high volume, 500,000 metric tons of scrap, 1,000,000 metric tons of scrap. Once the buyer takes the bait, they will ask you for an initial amount to take care of the formalities. It would be anything from $3,000 to $10,000 or even more. They will ask the buyer to wire them the money, and then they will not encourage any bank or third party to do any due diligence. Some of them are content with the money that you send them and they disappear. Others will even forge the shipping documents and get the freight charges and just disappear. So who's the victim of these scammers? Usually buyers who are greedy, who are looking for a deal on the cheap and the sly. They're looking for quick money from the commissions, and it's all a scam. There are no quick deals over the internet. You must have strong relationships. You must know who you're dealing with. You must have honest contacts. Let me give you a few tips that will help you avoid these scams. First of all, check the company name. If they have a registration number, check it as well. Contact the country's ministries. Just look in the yellow pages if they have a yellow page in that country, or contact the local embassy. If you're going to do payments, do them by 100% LC. Do not give them any advance payment. Always do a trial shipment of a container. If they can't do a single container, what makes you think they're going to be able to do 30,000 metric tons? This one test of one shipment is usually the best way to determine whether or not the potential seller is for real. Also, nominate your forwarders to handle the shipment. If you do not have a contact there, find a freight forwarder in your country who has an agent in the country where you are buying the goods from, and get them to monitor the transaction for you. There's a lot of work to do in international trade shipments, so you're going to have to learn the ropes yourself. The only way to do this and do it correctly is to learn the ropes and do it yourself.